find that your vote's worth a whole lot more than 1 in 99. And you begin to have influence on what happens. And we really do, in the modern society, where so many of the things that come in front of a legislature or a governor or a senator do reflect engineering decisions, we need more who have engineering talents and engineering background serving right in the legislature, not just advising the legislature. Serving right in the Congress and not just advising the Congress. So when I ran in for governor, I campaigned partly on things like speeding up construction of the interstate system, which was bogged down at the time. My slogan was a blueprint for progress. And I knew that it was a pretty good slogan when we got into a debate with my opponent for the governorship, and he, in a very derogatory manner, started referring to the something for progress. He couldn't remember that it was a blueprint. But once you get the other guys talking about your issues and your slogans, you know you're working well. Well, when I became governor, I found very early that there were plenty of occasions where engineering was a critical element in what I was doing. I don't know how many of you even know what this is nowadays. This is my miniature version, but how many here know how to work a slide rule? That's unusual. The last time I talked to an engineering group here, only 2 out of 50 knew, and both of them said their dads taught them. But shortly after I was, we finished the first legislative session. And about a week later, I had a call from the superintendent of public instruction saying, we have a problem. There was an error made in the allocation of money for common schools, and we're way short. We're going to need a special session to correct it all. And I said, well, come on, everybody worked on that thing. Come on, there can't be that much of an error. He said, oh, yes, there is. And so I said, okay, bring your group over. And the next day we met, and we sat around the table, and they went through the whole process. And I was looking at the papers, and I looked at them carefully, and I thought, I think you got an error here. So I turned to the desk, opened the desk drawer, pulled out the slide rule, and in stunned silence, they sat there while I worked it back and forth and then put it down. And I said, I think you have an error. Oh, they protested. I said, well, you go back, check your figures, and let me know. The next day, I had a call from the superintendent of public instruction, very chagrined. They had made an error in their calculations. They did not have a problem. There was no crisis, and no session was necessary. I never used my slide rule again. But there were occasions when I'd open my drawer, pick it up, and when they got into an argument, I just waved it like that. That story really got around, and it was a powerful help. The budget is really important, and when you get to be a governor, here you are, you're supposed to execute faithfully the laws of the state of Washington, and you carry out all of the bills and the things that the legislature passes. You do engage in the legislative process to the degree you can veto or not veto bills. But a governor, especially in the state of Washington, you begin to wonder how much power you really have. When I became governor, I started thinking about it. Of course, I knew from being in the legislature what the circumstances were, but now I was governor. I realized that there were 9 other separately elected officials who did not report to the governor and had substantial responsibilities. The superintendent of public instruction for education, the commissioner of public lands for our public lands. And there were a whole host of issues like that. And then I found, and I knew that we had too many commissions in government, and the commissions were led by people who had been appointed by my predecessor. And it would take several years to get your own people as terms ran out and new commissioners were elected. And so Parks and Recreation and the Game Department, the Highway highway department, and the tax commission, all of these were run by someone who didn't report to me. So I said, "Gee, what kind of power do I have?" And I really finally figured it out. The one thing the governor can do is present the budget to the state legislature. And I said, there's where the power is. If you know more about the budget and are more agile with figures than anybody else, you've really got some power. Because they may be a separately elected official, but if you decide their budget is too big and you want to shrink it down or you want to change it and modify where it goes, you get first shot by presenting the governor's budget to the legislature, and then they've got to go down if they want to change it and argue for change. So I ended up spending a good deal of my first year in the fall sitting in on every budget hearing of every department in state government. And it took hours and hours and hours, but by the end of it, I not only knew more about the budget than any legislator would, but I had also found some things where I then called back two departments and say, hey, you said this, and they don't jive. And so you can sort out what was going on within your own administration. And then when I went to the Senate, I found the same thing. This is just kind of hopping and skipping on some of the areas where engineering really does play a big role, or at least the knowledge of engineering, or the familiarity with figures, with budget, with the kinds of things that engineers are skilled at are pretty darn important. One of the biggest bills we took on for Washington State when I was in the Senate was the Wilderness Bill. And the Wilderness Bill really brought me right back to my early civil engineering background, because much of the Wilderness Bill was debate on where and how much of 2.5 million acres we should put in the wilderness. And you had to know the territory pretty well. We had maps that wouldn't quit. And we ultimately passed the bill not by depending directly on staff, but by gathering together all the members of the House and the two senators. So there were 9 of us at the time, 10 of us at the time. And we gathered together and we locked out all the staff and built the Wilderness Bill ourselves. And I had a real opportunity at that point to kind of move and muscle things and really contribute perhaps more than the average, because I could look at and understand and respond to what others were saying. Well, we want so much, or we want this place, or we want this kind of wilderness to be saved. But then it had to be translated into, okay, where and how much, and what are the boundaries, and how do you do it? And that was a great success. We ended up with one of the largest wilderness bills in the country at the time, 1 million acres of new wilderness for Washington State. And it was one bill that was not done primarily by staff development, but done almost entirely in 2 5-hour sessions by the members themselves.